Hello everyone and welcome to the back room. In this episode I'm looking at two relatively obscure hardware emulators for the Atari ST. Aladdin, which is a Mac emulator, and SuperCharger, which emulates an IBM PC XT. These emulators both appeared sometime around the end of the 1980s, 88 or 89, and were true marvels at the time. Emulation was still relatively in its infancy, and both these emulators provided rock solid and speedy emulation of their target machines. They're known as hardware emulators because, well, they're both hardware based. Aladdin is an ST cartridge which contains the high and low 64K ROMs from the Mac 128 and 512, forerunners of the venerable Mac Plus, together with a GAL which interprets calls into the ROMs from the ST. The ST itself provides processing power, memory, I/O and a display. Like all other Mac emulators, with the advent or until the advent of Spectre GCR, Aladdin suffered from an inability to read and write Mac floppy disks directly, which meant that access to a Mac was pretty much a necessity in order to move the software around. SuperCharger is effectively a complete PC in a small box with its own V30 processor and memory, which is interfaced to the ST via 19-pin hard disk port. It also has a through port so that you can connect a hard drive with this in a daisy chain. The ST provides I/O and a display. SuperCharger operates in a similar way to the CPN systems, the ATR 8000 and Indus GT, available for the Atari 8-bit machines. In effect, the Atari is acting as a terminal to a CPM computer. Though similar, SuperCharger is hugely more sophisticated and integrated into the ST than that, and with some clever programming it can even be used as a parallel processor alongside the Motorola 68000 in the ST. There were a number of iterations of both of these emulators. Here I'm using Aladdin in version 3 and SuperCharger in version 1.10, although I will attempt to upgrade the SuperCharger to version 1.4 if I can locate the required software. In version 3, Aladdin was pretty much at its peak in terms of sophistication of product and features. The emulator shipped in attractive packaging, which unfortunately I no longer have, but it featured nicely produced and well written manuals, as you can see here. Effective graphics on the cart itself, on the packaging, and on the discs and the manuals. And a really nicely engineered cart which can be hellish to open, but I'll reveal the secret of entry without destroying it in a bit. Oh, and by the way, Aladdin is spelled as you see it here because the product originated in Germany, and that's how they spell it there. Interestingly, and despite treading a very fine line in terms of Apple copyrights and intellectual property, Aladdin was bootlegged and released as software-only PD discs known as Mac Bongo. I have my Mac Bongo discs dating from around 1990 or 1991, and we'll be having a look at them and trying to get the emulator working later in the episode. Because I'll be taking a relatively deep dive into both these emulators, I've decided to devote separate episodes to Aladdin and SuperCharger, otherwise I'm in danger of producing a vastly overlong video. And in this episode I'll begin with Aladdin. So let's put SuperCharger to one side. To use these emulators you must have an Atari ST, of course, and here I'll be using my Atari 520 STM, bought by me in 1998 as a bundle with an SM124 monitor and an SF314 double-sided floppy drive. The ST was my dream machine at the time, and it meant I had to live on dry bread and water for a month or two to pay for it. It superseded, but I wouldn't say displaced, a beloved Atari 800 XL. The computer is largely unmolested, although it is looking a little bit yellow nowadays, though I did upgrade it to a meg of memory a few years ago, probably 20 years ago now. The screen works perfectly, but for convenience, if not for clarity, I'll be using a VGA monitor as a display. And the SF314 decided not to read discs just as I began to record this episode, and so I'll be using a third-party drive contemporary with the computer. The SF314 will feature in a future repair episode. In the UK, Aladdin was distributed by Signet Publishing of Camberley, Surrey, a company which offered a number of products for the ST, including Calamus, the desktop publishing package. Aladdin went through a number of iterations, growing ever more professional in presentation until its peak around version 3, seen here. Unusually, the product shipped with the required Apple ROMs already installed, which was a massive leap forward at the time. Sourcing or bootlegging ROMs for an emulator was difficult because so few people had Macs, and those that did not want you opening them and ripping off the ROMs. Unfortunately, the installed ROMs are the 64K variety of the Mac 128 and 512. That didn't make a great deal of difference initially, and in press reviews Aladdin stood its ground very well against rivals such as Gadget by Small's Spectre 128. This latter sported the 128K ROMs of the Mac 512KE and the Mac Plus. What all this means is that Aladdin lacked the HFS file system and the ability to run applications such as HyperCard, which was making big headlines at the time. Nonetheless, it proved a rock-solid contender for smooth and sophisticated Mac emulation, and in 1988 or 89, the key to acceptance of these emulators was primarily whether they could be used productively in real-life situations, thereby giving ST owners a very cheap Mac and access to phenomenal software. I mentioned earlier that opening the cart is much harder than the Aladdin manual would have you believe. In a paragraph describing updating Aladdin, the manual suggests: to begin with, you have to open your Aladdin cartridge. Do not worry if you cannot open the cartridge with the first try. The cartridge is very solid, so use a little more force the next time you try to open it. In practice, using a little more force is liable to result in breaking the plastic clips. For the curious, here's how I do it. I use a guitar pick as a spudger, and I start by working the spudger underneath the front lip of the cartridge behind the contacts, applying gentle pressure and twist, and working slowly to one of the sides until I can feel the clips give. It can help to insert a fingernail to apply direct pressure to the clip. There are 3 clips on each side, a smaller one at the front and 2 larger clips at the rear or at the side of the body. Once open, the cart reveals its hardware secrets. There were 2 flavours of 64K Mac ROMs designated Revision A and B, and this cart has Revision A ROMs. These ROMs are numbered 342-0220-A and 342-0221-A. Each ROM is 32K, arranged in high-low configuration. Also in the cart is the well-known Lattice GAL 16V825LP, a programmable logic chip, here dated May 1988. Owners of versions earlier than 3 could upgrade their carts with a new GAL from the distributor. My cart sat unused for many years, and though it worked, it was somewhat unreliable until I reseated the chips with some contact cleaner. So having looked inside, let's see Aladdin in action. As mentioned, Aladdin cannot access Mac discs directly, and there's been some discussion over the years on the various Atari forums about the difficulty of transferring software to media that the system can read. Revisiting some of these discussions recently, it quickly became clear that while offering up advice, many of the correspondents do not understand the process at all, or else confuse Aladdin's software transfer with that of Spectre 128. In fact, although it's cumbersome, the process is actually quite simple, presupposing you have access to a classic Mac of some description, such as the Mac Plus I have here. 2 discs are shipped with Aladdin, one for the Mac and one for the ST. Each disc contains the required transfer software And Aladdin's manual even provides plans for a very simple serial cable to link the two machines. Rather than with single or multiples of files, the transfer works with logical 350K and 400K disks, depending on whether your ST has a single or double-sided drive, and unfolds something like this. Store your Mac applications as files on a floppy disk in your Mac's drive. Insert a blank formatted floppy in the ST and initiate the transfer. When it's completed, you will have a floppy disk that is a replica of the one in the Mac and can be read by Aladdin just as if it was a Mac disk. And here are some I prepared earlier, i.e. back in 1989. Before booting Aladdin, it's a good idea to configure it to make best use of your ST's attributes. But before we do that, of course, we need to plug in the cartridge. Boot the Aladdin ST disc, enjoy the attractive splash screen, cycling around for a few minutes, and then select C when you've seen enough. You can set up memory size, drive configurations, etc. here, and also elect to install a super disk, which is a reset-proof RAM disk from which you can boot Aladdin and sidestep the need to swap floppies in and out when your Mac Atari requires access to its system disks. Save the configuration to disk, reboot the ST and press the spacebar from the splash screen. And of course, don't forget to make sure your write protect tab is in right position. That's better. Now, if all is well, at this point you'll be prompted for a boot disk, just like on a real Macintosh. Here's one I prepared earlier. You'll notice immediately, or those of you familiar with Macs will notice immediately, that rather than the Apple symbol up here, the Apple icon, we have Aladdin's lamp. In earlier versions of the Aladdin software, an apple appeared here, and I think after being leaned on a little, they decided to change it. Now, copy the system folder to the super disk. And then if we eject the boot floppy, the Mac Atari will boot from the super disk, leaving the floppy drive free for applications. And of course, booting from SuperDisk is far quicker. Once booted, Aladdin really is rock solid, and though it can be made to crash, a simple restart will get you back to the Finder just like with a real Mac. In operation, your ST is now a Mac and can be used productively and with confidence. Of course, just how productively a Mac emulator can be used built on the 64K ROM running on an ST in 2023 is anyone's guess. But for the fun of it, let's have a play with some classic software from the dawn of the Macintosh age. Aladdin can be set to recognise disk swaps automatically so long as the Write Protect tab is closed. However, I prefer to do the job manually by pressing Help after inserting a disk. To eject a disk on the Mac, you drag its icon to the wastebasket, and a similar system prevails under Aladdin, except that after dragging the icon, the activity light on the drive flashes as your signal that it's safe to eject the floppy. First up, Mac Paint. This application was shipped in 1984 with the original Mac 128K and was intended to demonstrate just how cool and accessible a computer with a graphical interface could be. You'll notice that the interface is sized for the Mac Plus screen, and this extra here is what the ST can offer. Many applications actually take advantage of this extra. And here is an older version of Aladdin. This one is version 1.3. There's a different splash screen, as you can see, and everything is in German, which is not too difficult to figure out, though I kept pressing Y to accept the save configuration settings and nothing was happening. Then I realised I was using what was probably a German keyboard layout, and so I pressed Z a few times and still got nowhere before I eventually realised that J for Ja might be the answer, which of course it was. How dumb is that, right? At least I got there in the end. Interestingly, this earlier version is much more Mac-like in its presentation. The startup is exactly as it would be on the Mac, with the same text and graphics, and of course now there is an apple in the top left of the screen corner rather than an Aladdin's lamp. And just as before, we can set the system folder on the super disk to boot the machine, and it will boot much faster than it does from floppy. Personally, I prefer this earlier version. It gives much more of a Mac feel to using the computer, and I do like to see the apple up here at the top left. And now to use this version productively, all I need to do is move across an English version of the System and Finder. And this is version 1.3 of Aladdin, but with an English Finder. The system alerts are still in German because I've yet to find an English system that will work with 1.3, but now I have English menus and a wastebasket in place of a Papierkorb, and I'm sure that's not the correct pronunciation. Finally, let's launch Right Now, a word processor with an interesting backstory. Apparently, Steve Jobs didn't believe that Mac Write would be ready to accompany the launch of the first Mac, the 128, in 1984, and so he had a parallel team work on another processor called Right Now. Though Mac Write was completed and did in fact ship alongside Mac Paint, Right Now is generally considered to be a superior product and more in line with the ethos of the Mac. The word processor and the team behind it went to Next with jobs, and it was ported to the Next operating system. That's it for this look at Aladdin. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and please check back for the next installment when I'll take a close look at the PC emulator SuperCharger. Thanks for watching everyone, and see you again in the back room.